Hello and welcome back to my world of stuff. Today's video is one I've been aching to do for quite a few weeks, and it's one that I've teased occasionally when I put my forthcoming attractions posts up on the YouTube community page. And it is a classic piece of retro TV. As many of you know, this channel is largely devoted to retro TV and retro films, and it's great fun to revisit old TV shows and research them and just talk about them for 15-20 minutes on this channel. And I really love the responses that I get back from people whose memories have been reawoken by talk about shows that they've pretty much forgotten about as they've just got on with their lives. Today's show, however, is one that's frustrating because it's a show that was hugely popular from 1968 to 1973 when it ran for 8 13-part seasons. But unfortunately, there's very little information available about it online, which has made researching it quite difficult. Anyway, let's talk about that series, Freewheelers. Hello, welcome back to my world of stuff. My name is Paul Mount. Yeah, talking about Freewheelers today. And as I said, it is frustrating to be doing this video because it isn't as complete as I would like it to be. Normally when I do my videos, I like to do a lot of background research, and it's often quite easy to do that because most of the shows I talk about still exist in total. So they're either available, you can watch them, or they've been written about extensively, and it's easy to cherry pick the information that you need to give a broad overview of a particular series or film. That's not the case with Freewheelers. I suppose we're quite lucky in that many of the shows I talk about on this channel still exist in their entirety. I'm thinking of things like The Tomorrow People and Time Slip, and some upcoming shows that will be appearing on this channel very, very soon from a little bit later on. Some shows are frustratingly incomplete, like Ace of Wands, a favourite of this channel, but only one of its 3 seasons exists. Doctor Who fans, of course, will be famously frustrated by the 97 episodes that remain missing from the show's black and white archive. And there's a long list of shows from the 60s, BBC shows like Out of the Unknown, A for Andromeda, early Quatermass episodes from the 50s that don't exist. They weren't tele-recorded and preserved in the archive because it wasn't considered necessary to do so. TV considered as a sort of ephemeral medium. So shows were made and broadcast, and then the tapes were wiped and reused because tape at that time was a pretty expensive format. So I'm left today talking about Freewheelers, a show which ran for 104 episodes, of which just over 50 remain in the archives, and most of them aren't really of broadcast quality. The only season which exists in a reasonable transmission format is season 6, which is the reason why it's the only one that's ever been released commercially on DVD. So it's frustrating to talk about the show because of the fact that so much is missing. Season 1 exists in a pretty ropey format. Seasons 2, 3, 4 and 5 don't exist at all apart from random scraps and maybe an episode from season 2. As a consequence, it isn't a show which has received a lot of attention from journalists and writers talking about cult TV because it is so hard to find it. There is a book called Calling White Nights, which is published by an independent press a few years ago. I tried to access a copy of that book so I could research the show a bit more and present a little bit more detail about it, but that's a whole story in itself. Well, I didn't actually get that book. So what I'm able to do today, I think, is do a potted history of the show, its various cast comings and goings, because across its 8 series, its main cast changed quite a lot. The format always remained much the same, but the main hero figures changed quite a lot across the show's run. So I'll do my best to at least jog some memories, even if I'm not able to fill in all the blanks and do all the deep shading, which I might normally like to do. Freewheelers then was a children's television series made by Southern Television. This again is in the days when ITV was split into various regional franchises that all produced individual content for ITV as a network. Southern TV in particular made a lot of kids TV programs. That was sort of their speciality. And by 1968, a writer, producer, director called Chris McMaster, who had incidentally directed dozens of early episodes of Coronation Street, he found himself at Southern Television, and he had noted the popularity amongst younger audiences of apparently adult adventure series like The Avengers and Department S, and things like James Bond. He knew that kids liked adventure stories, and he came up with the idea of doing that sort of thing for kids, but obviously without the extreme violence, the sadism, the sex, and so on. A clean-cut adventure series in which teenagers would be the heroes. He particularly, though, didn't want very young kids. He wanted these kids to be 17, 18, so that they could do certain things. They could go to pubs, they could drive cars, they could do things that would help move the plot forward rather than be hidebound by waiting for adults to get them involved in situations. The format then, and I'm not entirely sure how it started, as I said, because this first season isn't available. I don't think it sort of sets things up in the way that shows like Time Slip and The Tomorrow People did, which were introductory stories. It starts off with a group of 3 kids becoming involved with a senior MI5 agent called Colonel Buchan, played by Ronald Leigh-Hunt. He is very much a James Bond type character. He spins around in fast cars. He's a master of disguise. He is what you'd think James Bond would be in his late 50s. As the series started, he becomes involved with a group of teenagers who find themselves caught up in a web of intrigue which involves the machinations of the mysterious and evil Karl von Gelb, ex-Nazi officer who is still embittered by World War II, and he's determined to inflict revenge upon his former enemies in the UK so that he can reverse the verdict of the last war. The first 13 episode season was split into 3 distinct stories, entitled Menace, which ran for 4 episodes, Recipe for Danger, which ran for 4 episodes, and the finale story, The Big Freeze, 5 episodes. And in this first story, von Gelb took possession of a nuclear submarine. His plans were to launch a Polaris missile, which would cause chaos on the UK mainland. In later stories, he would try to subjugate the population of the UK with a mind control device. And in another story, he tried to pollute the country's water supply with something called Formula Xander. The series was then characterised by lots of action outdoors, running about, leaping around, car chases, battles. Von Gelb himself had his headquarters on a motor cruiser called the Brunhilde. This was in fact Southern TV's outside broadcast roving news yacht, the Southerner, which obviously was available for Chris McMaster and his team to use. And it gave the show an extra gloss, an extra sheen, because they were able to film a lot of outdoor sea-based action sequences, which really enlivened the show and gave it a sense of the spectacular, even though it was a fairly low-budget drama series. Although Chris McMaster had created the series, he only wrote and directed for it occasionally. And that first series, that began on the 4th of April 1968, running for 13 weeks, was variously written by James Hopes, Barry Busbridge, and one Trevor Preston, who a few years later would go on to create his own adventure series for children, and that's Ace of One. The Freewheelers, our teenage heroes in that first series, were Bill Cowan, played by Tom Owen, son of Bill Owen, who of course played Compo on Last of the Summer Wine for the BBC for hundreds of years, it seemed. And in fact, Tom Owen himself took over when Bill Owen passed away as Compo's son in the last years of that particular series. We also had a character called Chris Kelly, played by Gregory Phillips, and Mary Maud, played Terry Driver. They were the Freewheelers in that first series. Season 2 kicked off just a few months after the end of the first series, which had ended in June 68. The second series started on the 20th of November. Again, 13 episodes split into 2 stories this time. The Xander plot, which was the plot I mentioned where von Gelb tries to poison the country's water supply, and The Secret Base for 5 episodes. These episodes were written by Don Douglas and Keith Miles, Rick Trader Whitcomb, Barry Busbridge again, and Brian Cooper. In this particular series, Tom Owen's Bill returned, as did Mary Maud's Terry. Chris Kelly did not return, but a new character, Nick Carter, played by Chris Chittle, no less, joined to battle von Gelb across 13 more episodes. Chris Chittle, as many of you may know, went on to appear briefly in The Tomorrow People a few years later, and he's now been a regular on Emmerdale Farm, or Emmerdale as I should call it, as Eric Pollard since he joined the show in 1986. Season 3 changed the format slightly. Now we had one 13-part story with individual episode titles. Now I suspect, and as I say, unfortunately, these seasons don't exist, I think there might have been some dovetailing in that the plot might have changed slightly. A plot might have been thwarted, and then von Gelb would reconstitute himself to form a different storyline across the 13 episodes, but they weren't split into separate stories as such. The episodes now were written by Chris McMaster himself, Barry Busbridge, John Cannon, Keith Miles and Paul Erickson, a name that Doctor Who fans may recall as the co-writer of the 1960s William Hartnell story The Ark and its novelisation a couple of decades later on. The main cast changed yet again. We had Bill Cowan, still played by Tom Owen. He was still on board. Chris Chittell's Nick remained into that third series, but Terry, played by Mary Maud, moved on. She was replaced by Fiona, played by Carol Molan, that again ran quite soon after the end of the second season, which had finished February 1969. Third series started in July 1969. Slightly longer gap for season 4, which debuted in April 1970. This again featured a new roster of freewheelers. Tom Owen was still around. Fiona, played by Carol Molan, was still around, joined by Mike, played by Adrian Wright, who'd stay with the show for the next few seasons. This saw some changes to the format of the show. It was now in colour. Von Gelb, as a regular recurring villain, was written out because by now Southern TV were selling the show into Europe, particularly into Germany, and it was probably felt not extremely politic to have an embittered and slightly caricatured Nazi villain as the regular villain. So Jeffrey Toon's character was written out, which was a bit frustrating for him, I believe, as an actor, because he was banking on the money to buy himself a new sports car. Series 4, again, 13 episodes, telling a long story across its run, but with different plot elements coming into play here and there. This was written by Brian Cooper, Rick Trader Whitcomb, Chris McMaster himself again, Paul Erickson returned, as did Keith Miles. The show was now a huge success, but unfortunately at this point, as it was moving into its 5th season, this is where Southern TV, and it sounds like an incredibly stupid and short-sighted thing to do, they ditched the tapes of the first 4 seasons, even though they were fairly new productions. It was felt that there was no further commercial value in them. The tapes were wiped. This sounds to us today like a huge act of cultural vandalism. But as I mentioned earlier on, at the time, nobody considered about the prospect of selling TV shows to the public years later on various home video formats. Once the shows had been sold to whatever markets they were interested in, they were just sitting on the shelves. They weren't repeated very often, if at all. They were just clutter, I suppose. And it's something that we find mind-boggling today, because today's TV shows, TV networks, TV stations, they're all kept digitally. They're not kept on tapes anymore. It is very much a different age, but we can't stop but wish that these people hadn't done these things and somehow foreseen that these shows were an important part of British culture at the time, but a different way of thinking, unfortunately. So as Freewheelers headed into its 5th season, its first 4 were already being junked. Season 5 started in January 1971, again just 5 months after the end of season 4. Again, 13 episodes, this time written by Richard Montez and Paul Erickson. They carried the weight of writing the entire season. The season 5 cast was different again. Now, Tom Owen's Bill finally left the series. Adrian Wright's Mike was still on board. New character called Max, played by John Colclough, he appeared. And Sue Craig first appeared, played by Wendy Padbury from Doctor Who. She'd been playing Zoe in Doctor Who, and still having a sort of an elfin teenage look about her, she was cast as Sue. Again, it's hard to pinpoint exactly what the storylines were because these episodes are lost in the mists of time and it's hard to find the information about them. But I have been able to discover that one particular plot involved an experimental new type of accelerant. So certain parts of the story revolved around a motor racing plot. Season 5, in fact, was the first season that didn't feature the sturdy support of Ronald A. Hunt's Colonel Buchan, because at the time the actor was filming Le Mans, a big budget feature film, and the shooting schedule overran a little bit. So he had to be written out, and a new character called Major Graham, played by Eric Flynn, was drafted in to fill in for Buchan. This must have been slightly disconcerting for fans of the series because it was the first series that didn't have any of the original cast from season 1, and Colonel Buchan was gone as well. So for fans, it might have seemed as if this was an entirely new show, labouring under the same familiar title. However, there was no sign of the show's success waning. It continued to be hugely popular. And season 6, which, as I mentioned, is the one which you can find on DVD, and in fact, it's all on YouTube as well, if you want to take a look at it. This had, again, a slightly altered cast. We had Mike, played by Adrian Wright, still there. Wendy Padbury was back as Sue Craig. And a new character, played by Leonard Gregory, Steve Walker, appeared to provide some heft and muscle to the team. Ronald Lee Hunt was back, and as this particular season exists, we can talk a bit more about it, even though I haven't seen it for a very long time. But they introduced a new villain, Nero, played by Jerome Willis. He'd found a way to end food shortage by bombarding food and plankton and so on with radiation, but he became embittered when he lost his financial support. And the season also saw the return of two slightly comedic, bumbling henchman characters. Dermot Ryan, played by the great character actor Richard Shaw, and Cassius Burke, played by the brilliant Hammer horror legend Michael Ripper. They'd previously appeared in season 5 in the motor racing storyline, and the series actually begins with them escaping from prison and being chased by police helicopters. And they also appeared throughout the series as it progressed through its 13 episodes. That particular season finished at Christmas 1971. The show was back again in September 1972, a slightly longer production time for that particular series. Scripts written by Ralph Wright and Peter Lover. And the lineup of the main characters here slightly changed again. Wendy Padbury wasn't available as she was pregnant and wasn't available for filming. Mike and Steve are back, joined by a new character, Jill, played by Caroline Ellis. The story here involved a Swedish villainess who was kidnapping nuclear scientist kids for blackmail purposes. As the series had worn on and become more popular, it had started broadening its horizon slightly, and in a couple of earlier seasons it had been filming overseas. So we had filming in Sweden and in Spain and in Amsterdam, again broadening that look of the show, which still frustratingly had that slightly clunky videotape studio interiors, and as has been observed several times in the past, a lot of those scenes looked as if they were just done in one take rather than repeated takes, because they have a slightly humdrum feel about them, slightly unbalanced by the quite lavish looking location filming and action scenes. Season 7 came to a close in November 1972, and the show returned for its 8th and final season in August 1973, another 13 episodes, written by Ralph Wright and newcomer David Stevens. And we had a slightly different batch of characters. Jill, played by Caroline Ellis, was gone. Mike was gone, and we now had Wendy Padbury returning as Sue, now with her boyfriend Dave, played by Martin Neal, an actor who Doctor Who fans might remember from Doctor Who's Warriors of the Deep in 1984. The story here ran across 13 episodes again, story elements including the thefts of secret technology and the copying of old masters, great masterpieces of art that would then be resold. A plot which is not entirely dissimilar to 1979's Doctor Who City of Death. So Freewheelers came to its end in November 1973, and I don't know why it ended. It was still extremely popular, but it came to a halt at the end of its 8th season. It may well be that Chris McMaster had lost interest in his brainchild. Maybe the Southern TV felt the show had run its course and it was time for something new. So what remains of Freewheelers is this season 6, which, as I said, you can see on YouTube. Season 6, 7 and 8 have apparently been shown on Talking Pictures over the last few years, and I didn't see them, which is unusual because I always try to track down these odd bits of cult TV, and having really enjoyed season 6 when I saw it a few years ago, it could be the case I didn't realise they'd moved on to season 7 and 8. I don't know what the picture quality is. I don't think that they are as sharp as season 6, because if they were, I would imagine that Simply Media, who released season 6, would have gone on to release 7 and 8 as well, unless maybe season 6 didn't sell very well. And that, I think, is the great enigma of Freewheelers. It's hard to judge how successful it was because so little of it remains for us to watch. And it is a show that just slipped out of public consciousness. As I said, it wasn't repeated. Episodes didn't exist, so it wasn't an attractive proposition for burgeoning cult TV satellite channels and streaming services to show for any nostalgia appeal, because there's just not enough of it to properly represent what it was. But I do remember watching it and really enjoying its simplistic adventure stories. This wasn't a show about characters. You never found out anything about the private lives or who these kids were. They were just kids with names who got involved in adventures, and they were heroic and they were brave and they were daring. We didn't know anything about them as people. Similarly, Colonel Buchan was this more mature MI5 agent with years of experience behind him, but you didn't know anything about him as a man beyond the fact that he was a spy. It was about the adventure. It was about the action, the chases, the car chases. There was loads of car chases and great use of helicopters and boats and ships, and it really made use of the facilities that were available in southern England. And it was a breath of fresh air at a time when a lot of kids' TV was quite low budget and studio based and not incredibly imaginative. I think that big explosion of imagination came in the late 60s into the early 70s, and Freewheelers was riding along with that by doing these exciting junior James Bond stories. I just wish I could tell you more about what those stories were in series 2, 3, and 4 and 5. But they're lost to the archives. And even though the show was sold abroad, it seems unlikely that any of those tapes are ever going to return, certainly 50 years after the event. A lot to recommend in Freewheelers. I think many people will remember it for its iconic signature tune, this really upbeat piece of music, which is called Teenage Carnival by Keith Mansfield. It was a piece of stock music which they used, and it just summed up the adventure of the show. It ran over a title sequence which had this logo, then you see the cast and some action sequences of all the hardware, and it was punctuated by incidental music from Laurie Johnson, who did a lot of work in the Avengers, a lot of repeated sort of dramatic music that would underpin what was going on screen. It's a great old series, and as I said, I wish I could tell you more about it. I'm indebted to this viewing notes booklet on season 6, written by Marcus Hearn, which has helped fill in certain gaps, certainly in terms of the comings and goings of the various characters. And as I said, it is a shame that that book, Calling White Knight, is so hard to get hold of. So I hope that this quick run through the series has brought back some memories, even if not detailed memories. And it frustrates me that I'm not able to say, well, in season 2, this happened and that happened, which might be a little bit dry. So I've just gone through the history of it in terms of the seasons. And I think the various cast members, it's interesting that, a bit like Doctor Who, its characters changed from season to season and after 2 or 3 seasons, possibly to reflect its young audience who might have got bored with seeing the same people, the same characters. Quite possibly the actors wanted to move on to something maybe a bit more dramatically challenging. Who knows? But I hope that this video, whilst not incredibly detailed, has just reminded you of the show, because I think with a show like this that has left very little cultural footprint, it's easy for it to be forgotten. It did, however, have a bit of an after image. 2 paperback original books based on the series were published in 1971, The Sign of the Beaver, and in 1972, The Spy Game, both written by Alan Fennell. And the fondly remembered Look-In, the Junior TV Times, ran a comic strip from its first issue in 1971 right up to issue 26, then returned in issue number 50 in 1971, and then for the first 11 issues of the 1972 volume before it disappeared. I think they also ran a couple of text stories. And from what I remember, they were in the same fast-paced sort of adventurous style of the TV series itself, with some really great comic strip art. There were no annuals, there was no other spin-off merchandise, despite the fact that it was an incredibly popular TV series. And the great enduring tragedy is the fact that so much of it doesn't exist, and the fact that it has been forgotten by so many. So as I said, despite the lack of detail in this video, hope it's just given you a brief taste of the show and a reminder of the show if you saw it at the time. So if you are a fan of Freewheelers, if you know a bit more about Freewheelers, or if you have more information about it, and particularly if anything I've said in this video or reported in this video is slightly erroneous or incorrect, I would love to hear from you. So if you'd love to leave a comment down below about anything I've got wrong or anything I've missed out or any information you may have, I'd love to fill in the blanks. Right, thank you for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed it for all its faults and great gaping chasms of information. But if you have enjoyed the video, why not stick around to this channel? Loads of retro TV stuff here, retro films, unboxings, lots of Doctor Who type stuff. So all you have to do is like and subscribe to the channel. You can do it by clicking on that thing there, or you can click that QR code with your phone and that will subscribe you to the channel. Hope you've enjoyed the video. I will see you soon. Until I do, keep taking the stuff.